What if I told you that living your truth is actually the opposite of freedom? That the very thing that feels empowering could actually enslave us. Modern secular culture, normally living your truth means your inner feelings, desires, and identities are the highest authority. Truth is subjective, not objective. There isn't one truth, there's many truths. What might be true for you is different from me, and we can't really talk about it and come to a consensus what truth is because it looks different for every person. Identity is self-created. You don't discover who you are, you construct who you are. Authentic is prioritized over being obedient. Being authentic is seen more important than being faithful, obedient, and self-sacrificing. Resisting these desires is often framed as oppressing someone or being harmful. In today's world, suffering is meaningless and must be avoided. If something causes discomfort, it seems wrong by default. There is little room for redemptive suffering or discipline that comes from virtue. Lastly, affirmation is a moral duty in today's world and society. Disagreement about identity or lifestyle is often, again, labeled as hate. To love someone in today's world is to affirm them in their belief system. In a secular world, there's no shared or higher reference for meaning. If God, objective truth, or moral order are thrown away, someone still has to decide what is good and bad, and that normally becomes the self, which would be self-idol. It feels so empowering because it gives the self instant certainty. If your truth is the truth, you never have to wrestle with doubt, correction, or accountability. It replaces obedience with autonomy, and for a lot of people, obedience is uncomfortable. It implies that there's wisdom outside of you. It turns identity into something you can control. And in secular culture, identity is treated like a personal project. You don't receive who you are, you construct how you are. It removes moral friction. If right and wrong are grounded in personal experience, no one can meaningfully challenge you on that. Conflict gets reframed as you're invalidating my truth. That emotional protection feels empowering, but it actually shuts down growth. It mimics transcendence. Us as humans are wired to worship. When God is removed, the self steps in. Self-expression starts to feel sacred. Choices feel redeemable, and affirmation feels like salvation. It scratches the same itch, just without the healing. Let's talk about the fall in the Garden of Eden and how that connects to living your truth in today's world. The fall isn't just about eating forbidden fruits or breaking a rule. The Catechism claims it as a shift in authority. In the Catechism, it says, man tempted by the devil let his trust in his creator die in his heart, and abusing his freedom, disobeyed God's command. At its core, Adam and Eve stopped trusting that God's will was good and that they could decide the good and evil for themselves. Sin wasn't self-awareness, it was self-preference. To prefer self doesn't mean self-love or self-care. It actually means my judgment over God's wisdom, my desires over God's design, and my will over God's will. Serpent's temptation wasn't self-rebellion for self-rebellion's sake, it was for self-exaltation. Serpent says you will be like God, knowing good and evil. In other words, you won't have to receive the truth anymore, you'll be able to define it. It's the birth of what is now called autonomy over absolute authority. Choosing yourself feels empowering because it promises independence without obedience, knowledge without trust, and freedom without limits. And that power is borrowed and unstable. Once the self becomes the highest authority, everything else must serve it. Relationships, moral norms, and even God. That's why scripture shows the immediate repercussions of that. Hiding, shame, blame, and fear. Self-ruling doesn't lead to peace, it leads to fragmentation. Live your truth is the same thing, just in a modern language. It says truth comes from within, authority belongs to self, and no external claim can judge me. That's not new. It's Genesis 3 with better PR. The Catechism helps us see this clearly. The sin isn't first about behavior, it's determining who gets to be God. Christianity doesn't say the self is bad, it just says the self is wounded. Redemption doesn't crush the will, it heals it and orders it back to truth. Self-freedom isn't self-creation. That's why you don't hear Jesus say, assert yourself. He does say whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Because the self was never meant to be ultimate. It was supposed to be loved, received, and given back to God. If there's no higher authority, desires don't ask, they command. Christianity doesn't teach that desires are bad. It teaches that desires need a true authority so it could lead somewhere good. Without authority, desire fractures the self. What I want today contradicts what I want yesterday, and what feels like freedom now enslaves me later. Authority doesn't kill desire, it frees it from being tyrannical. We're told that freedom is doing whatever feels right to us, when in Christianity, freedom only exists where the truth is. Jesus says this plainly in the book of John. Know the truth, and the truth will make you free. Notice what he doesn't say. He doesn't say your feelings will make you free. or your choices alone will make you free. He says the truth, and the Catechism explains why. The more one does what is good, the freer they become. Feelings become the highest authority. Morality stops being about truth and just about self-justification. Right and wrong shift with emotion. What feels like authentic today becomes oppression tomorrow. That's what the Catechism also warns us about. Freedom and responsibility are inseparable, but feelings demand freedom without responsibility. It has to be affirmed, not examined, and that's where false freedom is born. Jesus continues, everyone who commits a sin is a slave to sin. Sin doesn't feel like slavery at first. It feels like relief and self-expression. You once chose freely chooses you now. That's not freedom, that's captivity with good marketing. Truth doesn't restrict freedom like a cage restricts an animal. It actually is more like guardrails that guide a train. Without rails, the train doesn't go anywhere. Without truth, freedom collapses. Christian freedom isn't I could just do whatever I want. It's I'm no longer ruled by what I want. Feelings are real, but they're not reliable moral authorities. You could also be completely sincere, but also completely wrong. Sincerity tells us how strongly we believe something, not whether or not it's true. Formed conscience doesn't ask, do I feel at peace with this? It asks instead, is this actually good? Without formation, the conscience becomes an echo chamber. It repeats our desires, our upbringing, our culture, but not the truth. Conscience is like a compass, but it only works if it's calibrated. It's off by a few degrees. In the beginning, you won't really notice until you realize you are not at the location you want to be at. The Catechism explains how the conscience is formed. Through education, prayer, scripture, and listening to the church. Not to control us, but to liberate us from our blind spots. Form your conscience is to admit sometimes that maybe you were wrong. And that's not weakness, that's wisdom. Because truth isn't created by sincerity. It's received through formation. After we talked about desires, the conscience, freedom, the question becomes, if I don't make myself the center, then what happens to me? The world assumes that surrender equals erasure, but Christianity proclaims something else. St. Paul says, it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. Sounds like self-loss until you realize St. Paul didn't disappear. He became fully himself. Modern culture teaches us to protect the self at all costs. Guard your autonomy, defend your identity, never give yourself away. The self that is never given becomes small and curls inward, becomes fragile, anxious, and self-monitoring. Self-worship will always shrink the self. Surrender doesn't mean suppressing your personality or uniqueness. It means placing them under truth so they can flourish. When Christ lives in you, your desires are purified, not erased. Your freedom is strengthened, not restricted. Your identity is rooted and not constantly negotiable. That's why saints are never born copies of each other. They're wildly different because grace perfects nature. Self-worship says everything must affirm me. Self-gift says I am secure enough to give myself away. One demands constant validation, the other one generates peace. One is exhausting and the other one is expansive. Because the self was never supposed to be a source of meaning, it was a gift that was supposed to be received and returned. Christian surrender doesn't ask yourself to disappear. It asks you to die to the false self, the one riddled with fear, anxiety, and constant self-assertion. Before this ends, I want to be very clear about something. This isn't about condemning people, it's not about labeling people or calling people stupid. Most people who are chasing their truth aren't rebellious. They're hurt. They're trying to survive, and they're trying to make sense of their lives, but the rules keep on changing. And the desire underneath all of it is actually good. We want peace, we want to belong, and we want our lives to mean something. The problem isn't the desire, it's the promise that is attached to it. We're told if we look inward, affirm everything, and make ourselves the highest authority, we would be set free. The self that has to be everything ends up exhausted. That's not failure, that's not weakness. That's the result of a lie that asks the human heart to carry more than it could bear. Christianity doesn't enter this conversation to win arguments. It enters to say you don't have to save yourself. Truth, in the Christian sense, isn't a threat, it's a hand reaching out. To crush you, not to erase you, but to lead you somewhere solid. You tried living for yourself and you're tired. Self-definition has left you more anxious instead of freed. If being authentic hasn't healed you in the way you hoped, that doesn't mean you're broken, it means you're made for more than self-worship. Isn't about taking something from you, it's giving you back to yourself. Because the truth doesn't condemn the heart, it rescues it.